In Chapter 4, we're going to talk about philosophy of physical activity. For philosophy of physical activity, we're going to examine the nature of philosophical thinking, describe how philosophy fits into the field of kinesiology, review the history of philosophy and physical activity, describe research methods used in the field, and provide an overview of knowledge in this domain by focusing on three issues: the nature of the person, nature and value of play, and ethics in sport. The goals of philosophy and physical activity in kinesiology include understanding the nature of health and physical activity, particularly in forms of exercise, sport, games, play, and dance, understanding the level of confidence in our claims in kinesiology, to understand the most important values of physical activity as well as its contribution to good living, and to learn how we ought to behave in sport and in our professional lives as kinesiologists. Why do we use philosophical thinking? It's often referred to as the queen of the sciences. It's basically the search and love of wisdom. Philosophy answers big meaning of life questions and uses research tools that transcend those in other disciplines. Decisions are made on good judgment and logic, and valid and reliable results are expected even without controlled experiments, as in physical sciences, with the nature of value in philosophy with reflection as key. Reflection allows us a broader range of phenomena to be studied as compared to other areas limited to testing, measuring, and examining physical objects. Reflection forces us to examine our own beliefs in greater depth and to develop well-reasoned arguments for them. It helps us become more open-minded. We entertain, examine, and possibly accept ideas, theories, and positions we may have previously ignored or discarded without reason. Looking at figure 4.1, we can see what we're going to be looking at for the first part of our class. Here we're looking at the sphere of scholarship of physical activity, and basically these are all of the subdisciplines within physical activity, and essentially you're going to take a class in most of these subdisciplines throughout your time at HBU. Looking at the subdiscipline, we're starting with philosophy of physical activity. Next we will be looking at history of physical activity, moving on to sociology, motor behavior, sport and exercise, psychology, biomechanics, and physiology of physical activity. Basically, all the subdisciplines are not separate. They really do work together. They are interdependent, not independent. A little piece of each goes into another. We just looked at figure 4.1 and we saw that philosophers and scientists are working together within the subdisciplines to make a kind of jigsaw puzzle analogy that all the subdisciplines are interdependent or fitting together. Validity of scientific and philosophical discoveries depend on collaboration before the puzzle pieces are made, and as such, philosophers and scientists have a moral obligation to work together. This is where we come up with the idea of holistic kinesiology. Philosophy's goal is to better understand the world and our lives in it. In kinesiology, that means to better understand human movement, or as is identified in our textbook, physical activity. Philosophic thinking is needed in order to address a number of issues that are important to kinesiologists, including what is the scope of our field, which is metaphysics, how confident are we in our findings, epistemology, what really matters in kinesiology, which would be axiology, and how should we behave as kinesiology, which falls within ethics. Looking at the history of philosophy and kinesiology, we have the early beginnings that start in the 1960s. American physical educators were studying philosophy of physical activity, were pursuing new directions by distancing themselves from educational philosophy and the single profession of physical education, and using philosophical techniques to produce new insights about physical activity itself, and especially sport. Early philosophers of note were Metheny and Schlecher. Metheny conceptualized movement as a source of insight and meaning for individuals. Schlecher used existential perspectives to examine ways in which sport enhances our authenticity as human beings, as well as our freedom and responsibility. In the 1970s, there was a kind of explosion of organizations, including the formation of the Philosophical Society of Study in Sport, which is now the International Association of Philosophy of Sport. We also had the formation of the Journal of Philosophy of Sport in 1974. Then coming into 2000 and present, we have a renewed interest in the subdiscipline, particularly with the focus of interdisciplinary research, and groups worldwide are increasing involvement, and no longer just North America. Looking at research methods and philosophy, we have three types of reasoning. Inductive reasoning begins with specific cases to develop broad general principles. Deductive reasoning begins with broad factual or hypothetical premises in order to determine more specific conclusions that follow from them. And descriptive reasoning begins with one example of a phenomena and then varies it to see how dramatically it changes. Change, or the absence of, allows a more accurate description of the central characteristics of an item being examined. Here we have a visualization of the three types of reasoning we just looked at. So inductive reasoning starts with specific case and becomes general. Deductive starts general and goes specific, and then descriptive reasoning looks at the example and describes the essential qualities. Looking at an overview of knowledge and philosophy of physical activity, we're looking at who our clients are and what a person is, the nature of a person, specifically the mind-body relationship, nature of sport and competition and the relationships to work and play, values promoted by physical activity, and ethical values in sports. Taking a look at what they call the person problem, or how to understand the mind and body, there are three theories. Materialism states that the human being is nothing more than a complex machine. Subjective experiences are real, but they have no power. Dualism is the mind and body are separate. Our thoughts count and priority is given to the mind. And then the third theory is holism. The mind and body are interdependent. All behavior is ambiguous, and the mind and body work together. Taking a look at understanding the popularity of sport, competition, and play, sport is grounded in artificial problems. Built-in inefficiencies create challenges, unlike most of life where we try to make things easier. Sport is a showcase for your motor skills, and its creation of excellence and meaning. Many sports skills would be meaningless in ordinary life without its direction towards sport. There's a lot of focus on sport and fair competition, sport as delightful play, which requires an autotelic or intrinsic attitude, sport as beneficial duty. There we'd be looking at things like representing your country, and meaningful combinations of sport, play, and competition. Values are our conceptions of the importance of things that we use to make decisions, both in personal and professional matters. Moral values refer to our character and how we ought to behave, and non-moral values refer to objects of desire, such as happiness, ice cream cones, and good health. Three of my favorite things. Taking a look at the values promoted by the field of physical activity, we have several different values. Health-related physical fitness, knowledge about the body, physical activity and health practices, motor skills, activity related to pleasure or fun. And each of these values is supportive of a different approach to participating in and developing physical activity programs. And the four values are not mutually exclusive. They often work together. So what ethical obligations do sports people have? We need to ask what is right and wrong and what ought and ought not to be done, which helps us answer the question, how should I behave? How should we behave? Formulating defensible standards of behavior, impartial, consistent, and critical. We want to follow a universal moral point of view, and no one counts more than anyone else, whether it be coaches, players, or fans. And there should not be any rule bending or intentional harm to other players. We have basic behavioral guidelines for sport, meaning that you need to follow the rules of the sport. The rules are the foundation for the artificial problem that you find special, so things like kick the ball in the goal, or kick field goal, or you can only go so far within the lines. So cheating alters and destroys sport and violates the results and legitimacy. You need to respect your opponent, and your opponent isn't a partner who shares in your interests and passions. You need to strive to bring out the best performance in one another. Recognize and celebrate athletic excellence, yours and others, whether that be your opponent or teammates. Seek opponents that are close to you in ability. It's not much fun when you have somebody who's an opponent who's far above your ability or far below. Care about your opponent's well-being as much as your own. Victory is fully meaningful when the opponents are at their best, and how you play says as much about you as the scoreboard does. Reflecting on our chapter about philosophy and physical activity and sports, let's take a chance right now to reflect on ethics in sports and your own activity, whether you're an athlete or just a recreational athlete, and consider your own sports participation. Have all your actions been moral and ethical? Have you had moral and ethical development? Maybe when you were 10 years old you didn't think too much of tripping somebody on the other team playing soccer, but now you would never do something like that. Think about your own values and how you make ethical decisions in sport before you begin your next competition, and be sure to consider what is good for the sport and the interest of everybody involved.